Thank you very much, Peter and Adele and Epilepsy Ireland for this amazing invitation, and I'm really honoured to be speaking with you all today at this first event like this at an Epilepsy Congress, and I agree completely with Francesca about the game-changing nature of this sort of event. So I, as Adele said, I'm a neurologist. I pretty much see only now people with epilepsy, and even amongst that group I tend to see really only people now with very severe, complex and often genetic epilepsies. And it was really listening to people with those epilepsies and their families that led me to be here today to speak with you about this topic of climate change and epilepsy. So just to be very clear, I am not a climate scientist. I'm just a neurologist who tries to help people with epilepsy. I do not know everything at all about the climate, so if you have any really complicated questions, I won't be able to answer them, or even any simple questions about climate change, I won't be able to answer them. But I am depending on the huge amount of work that a very large number of really excellent scientists have been doing for a long, long time, thinking about the climate and climate change. So I'm going to divide this talk into three sections. Firstly, I was going to say a little bit about what climate change is. If you're all happy with that already, and I can skip that, just say so now. Otherwise, I was going to give you a brief introduction. Shall I do that or not? You all know about it already. I can skip that. Fine. Great. Okay. Excellent. Okay. So then I'm going to talk about the second thing was why should we be thinking about it as the epilepsy community? And then lastly, I was going to talk about what do we do actually that contributes to climate change, and what could we do to reduce our contribution to climate change? Because of course we're all in the same world, and whatever happens somewhere else in the world that increases carbon dioxide emissions affects everybody everywhere. So it's, I guess, something for us to think about what we're doing that might be making the situation worse. Okay, so I'm not going to be speaking about the climate then. We're all aware of this. Great. Okay, so you all know, obviously, everything that's been going on in the world in terms of adverse weather events. Now, that's not necessarily all due to climate change, but there are some excellent scientific studies that show that climate change is having a significant effect on the frequency and intensity of things like heat waves and unexpected cold snaps. Okay, so and humans are contributing significantly to this. It doesn't mean it's all down to that, but we are responsible for a lot of that, and that's what we're seeing. We've seen in the Northern Hemisphere, for example, this year, fires in Canada, fires in Greece, islands being evacuated in Greece, and there's a lot going on which tells us that the climate around us is changing. So why should we be thinking about that then in our concerns about epilepsy and seizures and the comorbidities that go with that? So as I say, my attention was brought to this by seeing people and their families who are coming and saying, things have been like this or like that, and then with the heat wave, things got worse. And then I started asking people, because it's not something that I usually do, there's so many things to discuss in an appointment and so little time, that we tend to focus on things that we all think are important. But actually this is important too, and so I started asking people, so what happened with the recent heat wave? Did it make any difference? And some people it made no difference to at all, actually they enjoyed it, but for other people it had a huge impact of which I was totally unaware because I never asked about it. So some people were telling me, for example, with some particular genetic epilepsies, that the heat waves that we've been having had had a really terrible effect on maybe their own seizures or their child's seizures, and that it had changed their lives during those heat waves. So, for example, they weren't going out at all, not at all. They were drawing the curtains and closing the windows, which is the advice that you have for windows that are facing the sun to reduce heating in the home. And they were using cooling measures, and they were borrowing or sometimes even buying air conditioning units to try and cool the house down to avoid aggravation of seizures and other issues associated with that heat. And actually, as you're all here, and you all presumably have some personal family experience of epilepsy, can I just ask whether that's been an issue for you, whether heat waves have made things worse for you in your experience? Maybe just a show of hands. Okay, so not everybody, but a reasonable proportion of people, and of course I don't know who's involved in what way with epilepsy here, but a reasonable number of people. And I would presume, but this is a presumption, that most of you are from Ireland? Okay, okay. Not everybody, but maybe many people are from Ireland. And I don't know what's been happening in terms of heat waves in Ireland. And of course, in some ways, you know, maybe some parts of the world have been so far relatively protected. I think, for example, in the UK, we've had some heat waves, certainly, but we haven't had much in the way of other consequences, whereas, of course, in other parts of the world, it's been much more of an issue if you think about what's happened in Hawaii recently, for example. So maybe that experience that people have had maybe will change as time goes on, who knows. If there are more heat waves, if there are more intense heat waves, maybe that will change. So then we can think about maybe why could this be even a possibility? And actually, once we started looking at this, we thought actually that there are many levels at which events related to climate change, like heat waves, like floods, for example, or maybe even severe cold snaps, how they could influence aspects of the epilepsies and care of the epilepsies. And we've been looking at this, if you like, from every level. So because I'm interested in genetics, we've been looking at genes and how they work. We've been looking at the temperature of the body and how that's regulated. We've been looking at seizures themselves and how their frequency might be affected by heat. We've been looking at medications and their stability. And we've been looking at kind of broader things. So, for example, supply chains. What happens when there's a flood and your pharmacy is running out of the medication and you're about to go and get your medication prescribed, redispensed. So we've been looking at a range of different angles. We don't yet have hard data for all of these things. But what we have been doing is thinking, okay, so what do we know about epilepsy? And what do we know about climate change and its impacts on health that have already been established? And how can we link those things together? Okay? So let me give you one example. I don't know if you have this experience, but certainly I find it difficult to sleep in a heat wave. Okay? So I don't have air conditioning. Very few houses in the UK have air conditioning. And when it gets hot, the house gets hot, and it's often hot at night. And heat at night is something that many people find it makes it more difficult to get a good night's sleep. And actually this has been formally studied, and people have looked at how badly sleep can be affected by even small changes in the nighttime temperature. And it's surprising what proportion of people have more trouble sleeping even with a slight increase in nighttime temperatures. And you might have experienced, I was actually here in Ireland last year in Kerry and had a fantastic time. And it was that time when you probably remember it was really hot. It was really, really hot. And when it gets hot like that, then of course sleep can be disrupted. Now, many of you may have the experience that disruption of sleep can aggravate seizure control. I don't know if people have had that experience. Again, a show of hands, if that's, it's kind of, I think you can see it's a very common thing. So we know that a significant proportion of people who otherwise don't have any medical conditions find it more difficult to sleep. So you can imagine that if then your sleep quality is important for your seizure control and sleep is disrupted, you can imagine how that might then have a consequence on seizure control. So that's not yet directly been proven. I can't say that I have hard data to show you today that shows that during a heat wave, sleep was disrupted and that led to more seizures. But that logical, that well, I suppose it's speculative linkage, I think is very reasonable. And we are currently trying to get more information on that through various different ways. We're asking people for their experiences, but we're also looking at the temperature in the rooms where we record EEG in our diagnostic unit, in our video telemetry unit. So at the hospital in Queen's Square, the EEG video telemetry unit is on the 7th floor of quite an old building. It faces west. And when London gets hot, and cities get hotter than surrounding countrysides because the heat, there's a thing called an urban heat island effect, all the people and all the activity raises the temperature even further. The video telemetry unit gets really unpleasantly hot. There's no air conditioning. You can't open the windows because it's on the 7th floor. And people who are being admitted for testing often find it uncomfortable. It's not great. It's not really what we should be offering, but that's the situation at the moment. And what we've been doing is putting little temperature and humidity loggers in the rooms where people are having EEG recording. And so we're gathering information on the indoor temperature, not just what it should be outside, but what it actually is in the rooms where people are having EEG recording. And we're looking at how the EEG recording itself and the information from this is being affected by these higher temperatures. And so we are gathering data at this time. We've got some preliminary data from a very particular group of people who had EEG recording that happen to have been during a heat wave. And we see that whilst it doesn't affect everybody who had EEG recording at the time, a significant proportion of people had more EEG discharges or more seizures during the heat wave than they did outside the heat wave. So these were people who had relatively long periods of recording, and there happened to be a heat wave somewhere during that period of recording. So we could compare what happened during the heat wave with what happened outside the heat wave. And we're seeing, this is still early data, but we're seeing an increased number of electrical discharges and an increased number of seizures. So we're gathering evidence that is helping us think that there is actually, helping us test whether there is a link between heat waves and problems getting worse in epilepsy around heat wave, and we're beginning to see that. Now, one of the things that we're doing is, so, people say, okay, well, it shouldn't really be a problem because we regulate our body temperatures. So whether it's a cold room or a hot room, we're still able to sit there and listen to, a talk and function reasonably well. And yes, it's true, we do thermoregulate. We might shiver, we might sweat, depending on whether it's too hot or too cold, for example. But human thermoregulation is not perfect and it's not infinite. You can't raise the temperature to say, not that we would, but you can't raise it to say the temperatures you see in Death Valley of 50 degrees C and still expect people to be able to manage perfectly well. It doesn't happen, especially if it's more humid. So at our hospital, we have lots of different specialties. And I work with the neurosurgeons, not the neurosurgeons, well, I do work with neurosurgeons, do epilepsy surgery, but also some other neurosurgeons who look at something called the intracranial pressure. So sometimes people have a problem which means that inside the skull the pressure rises too much that causes a range of symptoms. And to monitor that and to help look after it, what sometimes the surgeons do is to put a little implant in. It's a little disc that sits on the skull, and the little stem from it goes through the skull into the fluid in the brain. Okay, and that the surgeons actually didn't pay any attention to this. They didn't look at it. There was no reason for them to do it. But as it happens, that device not just measures the pressure, but it also measures the temperature. And they weren't interested in that. They had no reason to be. But I'm interested in that. And what that allows us to do is look directly at what happens to brain temperature in someone who's otherwise relatively well and walking around. These people don't all have epilepsy, they have other problems, but it's an opportunity to look at what happens to the temperature inside the brain in an otherwise healthy person who's walking around doing their business. And what we see is that for some people, the temperature inside the brain rises by more than we might think. You might think it's really tightly regulated, at least I thought it was really tightly regulated, but actually it's not as tightly regulated as you might think. It changes sometimes in some people by up to 2 degrees C, which is much more, I think, than most of us would think would be the case. And that degree of change is enough, actually, to change the behavior of some cells in the brain. So I don't want you to run away with the idea that this is a problem for everybody all the time, okay? We don't know yet. I'm just giving you some of the early information that we're gathering that tells us that there could be reasons for thinking about this and links between these things. One of the other things we're doing is looking at medications. Okay, so obviously medications are, the mainstay of treatment for seizures in epilepsy. Medications come, as you all know, in many forms, tablets, liquids, and so on. We've been wondering, how stable are these medications? Okay, so companies are required to test the stability of medications under various temperature conditions. But they don't necessarily do that in a complicated way, replicating what might happen in the real world in somebody's home where there's been a heat wave. And one of the other things we've been doing is collecting data. So I work at a centre called the Chalfont Centre for Epilepsy as well. Some of you may have heard of this. We do lots of things there. One of the things that we do there is that we have about 100 people who live on site who have difficult to control epilepsy with a range of other problems. And so care is provided. This is their home. And we've been looking at the temperatures in the rooms of some of the residents there and relating that to whether during higher temperatures, for example, some people might have more seizures. And we've got some early information on that. And we've looked at those temperature profiles in those rooms with a heat wave. And then what we've done is subjected medication to similar profiles to see what happens to it. This is the kind of work we're doing because we think there might be a link here. We don't know. We don't know at all. But we're looking at this. And again, early data suggests that for some liquid medications, this might be an issue. The concentration of the medication appears to change in the liquid. Okay? So again, I don't want anyone to run away with the idea that we are all using medications that somehow aren't working. But what I'm trying to show is that there are many ways in which, for example, a heat wave might be relevant. And if we look at this more and we find there are changes, then maybe there is some advice that we need to be thinking about in terms of where people store their medications. I don't know where you might store your medications, presumably not on the windowsill, but I don't know. Do you store them in a room that gets a bit hotter, or do you store them in a room that maybe doesn't get so hot? Don't know. And I think we need to be gathering this kind of information to understand, should I be stopping? Yes.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions here. Sorry, thanks very much. We have a couple of questions here because I know we could talk about this forever, and okay. I know that you have another engagement that is a nice engagement to go to as well. But one of the things that we often speak about in our training, and there has been 2 very similar questions come in around climate control, temperature control, because one of the triggers for seizures we would note is deviation between hot and cold.
Yeah.
Have you any thoughts or evidence, let's say, around the use of cold showers? People are swimming all year round, things like that. And is it that, depending on where we live in the world, is how our body naturally regulates? That's a lot of questions.
That's a lot of questions. Okay.
Heat as a trigger.
Okay. So your last question is probably the easiest one. I think that generally people get used to the temperature averages in the area they grew up in. Okay. So, for example, Ireland, a bit like the UK, we're used to kind of moderate temperatures, maybe late teens, early 20s. That's kind of where we feel comfortable, what our houses are designed for. If you live, I don't know, let's say in Delhi in India, then you're used to slightly different temperatures. And what's hot for us may not be hot for people in India. So, yes, I think your local temperature does make a difference. In terms of what you can do, I think we don't yet have enough information for me to say to you, this is what you must do. But I think you will already have that experience. If higher temperatures clearly provoke seizures, then there are ways in which temperatures can be moderated. For example, it is important during heat waves to keep windows facing the sun shut, which was a surprise to me, but that's really what people who know about buildings and climate say you should do. You should draw the curtains, so you avoid that solar gain making the room hotter. You should try to be in the cooler part of the house, if you can, rather than the hotter part of the house. And in terms of cooling down, I think it's important to be sensible about this. You don't want to be, certainly not dunking somebody into a cold bath, but you also need to think there are ways in which actually you can cool people down that are safer. Amongst the ways that physiologists, people who study the human body, have taught me that people can sometimes help become cooler is to put a wet towel around the neck or to put hands in colder water. But this needs to be, you will all know your epilepsy or your loved one's epilepsy better than I do. And if you already know that provokes a seizure, obviously don't do it. But those are general pieces of advice to try and keep temperature down.
Thanks very much, Professor Sanjay, and we will now relieve you of your duties. And thank you very, very much.
Thank you.